Right, this is What the Jam. Today we have Bryan Robinson, who's the head of developer relations at Hygraph, a company in the Jamstack space. And Bryan has been a prominent member of the Jamstack community and had a podcast called That's My Jamstack. So excited to talk to Bryan today.
Yeah, how's it going? I'm excited to be here. Any excuse that gets me to talk about the Jamstack, especially in this day and age, I'll take it in a heartbeat.
Love it. Let's start off with, what does Jamstack mean to you?
Ooh. So taking a step back, right? I've been doing the Jamstack for 17 years. Uh, the Jamstack obviously not having been around 17 years ago, but that kind of dates me to my beginning as a professional developer 17 years ago. I actually worked in newspapers, and we had blogs in the system called Movable Type. And Movable
Mm.
Type was a blogging platform that when you clicked save, it generated via a Perl script HTML documents that got served. And when you would update a template, it regenerated all your HTML documents that got served. So I've been doing what the original definition of the Jamstack is for a long time, and that is pre-generating HTML to facilitate the most performant, best security websites you can make with whatever technology is available at any given time. Obviously, in the past 5 years or so, I guess it's 2023, so it's maybe even past 6 years.
Mm.
Um, I've been doing things like at first Jekyll, then Eleventy, and then to some degrees, you might consider something like early Next.js to be very Jamstacky. But the definition has shifted and pivoted across the board in so many different ways. I remember having a conversation with Phil Hawksworth way back in the day, where Phil was saying, Phil being DevRel at Netlify, Phil was saying that serverless functions were not technically Jamstack way back, like way back in the day, because it was not technically pre-generating HTML and shipping it to a CDN to then serve to your end user. But he would say it was like this kind of extra little bit of salt or seasoning in your Jamstack conversation. But now we look at like the ecosystem, and we look at things that used to focus on pre-generating, like Next. And Next.js is now very much I'd almost say it's a server-side framework.
Mhm.
It's not a front-end framework. It's not a static site generator. It's rendering these things at request time or via a very strong caching system, a la like the WordPress era. So what Jamstack is to me is very much in that static era. Now, I would say that serverless functions, very Jamstack. Like, I would disagree with that early statement from Phil about that not being the Jamstack, because I think that you can't make things nearly as interactive as we might want it to be without that. However, the heart has to be pre-generated, non-runtime HTML.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. I want to drill into that one a little bit because I think the serverless is where things start getting grey.
Yeah,
Because for me, there's a very clear cut static. If you just draw it along static, um,
sure.
when you get to serverless, it starts to get a bit blurry because the question is the serverless generating like maybe JSON content that's essentially an API that then the client side is consuming, or is it generating HTML markup and is actually doing a page load? Like I feel like that differentiation, in some ways it's not important, but I feel like for the definition of Jamstack, it's really important.
I I think personally, it does not matter for two reasons.
Mm.
The first being, if the Jamstack and static sites need to be a thing for as many people as possible to use, then we have to have a way of handling, at the bare minimum, forms, right?
Hmm.
Like the web is not interactive without forms of one sort or another. And so what I, at my very minimum, need is preferably a non-service based form solution for my static sites. And sure, like I'm trying to remember all of the tools I used to use way back in the day that I don't have to worry about now because I have serverless functions. Things like Wufoo, Formidable, FormStack. I could use these, but that's an additional cost. Or if I have the ability to use serverless functions, then I can do form handling. Or obviously, there are definitely services built into hosting providers nowadays that do this. The other side is this idea of being able to use serverless functions to create dynamic content on the fly and still have it potentially be considered Jamstack. And that's the grayest of gray areas for this conversation. But in looking at it, if I think about way back, I'm going to talk about Phil again. I love Phil. Way back in the day, he provided a virtual lolly, vLolly, as a demo of like what serverless functions could be and how you could render them. And he was serving back via these requests while waiting for the build, right? Like these things, these form submissions would build what he called like a virtual lolly, or for those of us in the States, a popsicle. And then you could send it with a customized message to somebody, and he would generate it dynamically at request time until such a time as the static HTML was built he was using 11D in the first version. And that was great, but it was also a pain because he was using like JS template literals to actually generate it via a node script. And so then I look at something like 11D and what Zach Leatherman did with 11D serverless. And there's this interesting, it's not dynamic in the way that Next handles its server rendering, but it's also not pure static. It's this kind of in between, but uses all of the mechanisms of how 11D would build sites, and just does it at request time. Again, I would say that's a middle step, right? Like while you wait for a build to happen, that's a great step. And still considering it Jamstack. It's a little bit of seasoning that goes into it. But when you've got maybe full page loads that are 100% always server rendered, then we start saying, is that Jamstack anymore?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, because on one hand, if you have an iframe with maybe a Google map in it, or a forum, or something that's generated dynamically on a static site, it's still a static site, but it has a lot of the trade-offs you're making for dynamic or serverless or whatever it is. So like, Is that Jamstack? And if that's not, then well, if that is, then serverless should be, or maybe even dynamic should be. It's hard to draw that line sometimes. Like where I like drawing it at static is once you jump over that line, you're making a different set of trade-offs, and that they're probably, in a lot of cases, they're worth it. Like in Phil's case, you give something to the user while it's been generated, and then you get the static part later, which is it's a trade-off where you have some more complexity, you have something rendered with serverless, but in the end you do get a basically a static site.
Here's where I like serverless with HTML coming down the pipe, and why I would prefer that to pure static.
Okay.
Because if I only have pure static, right, and let's assume I do not have serverless functions, I can recreate to a degree almost anything that I could do serverlessly by shipping more JS to the client.
Yes.
And I could add dynamism, I could add dynamicness to my site with client-side JavaScript that really probably these things should have been handled on the server level.
Yes.
And again, it's this kind of this idea of where do the separation of concerns come, and at what point is the developer experience degrading the user experience? And sometimes that's going to be allowing the JavaScript to handle it on the client side, and sometimes that'll be wanting to render it in some sort of server, aka for the most part nowadays serverless functions.
Yeah.
Where that line is important, but I wonder if they can both be somewhat considered Jamstack as long as the base of what's going on is pre-generated in some way.
Yeah, it's fascinating, eh? Like I definitely understand. Like those trade-offs make perfect sense. I think the problem that'll I see a lot of people having with Jamstack is it's all just kind of under one umbrella. So talking about that trade-off is hard because we don't have the language other than static and serverless and dynamic, and people don't really agree on what Jamstack is. So it's really hard to have that conversation.
Here's my favorite part, right? And so I should also mention I have a blog post that came out when everyone was talking about this, so I had to write something. But I titled it "Jamstack is Meaningless," and I get very philosophical, and I have a degree in philosophy. I talk Wittgenstein and like what ladders of understanding and kicking away the ladders, all sorts of stuff. I had a good time writing it, but the key is if you go back to the coining of Jamstack as a term, which I can't guarantee everyone knows, right? But like it comes from Netlify, Matt Billman, like coming out at Smashing Conf and saying like Jamstack, JavaScript APIs markup. That's why the JAM was capitalized for a long time. And like here are the initial tenets of what Jamstack means. And it was pre-generated HTML. It was using JavaScript to make some dynamic stuff, and then it was using APIs and all that. But very early on, after I got hooked on the Jamstack, which was a couple of years later, when I started the That's My Jamstack podcast, what I found very interesting was already there's a divergence in how people discussed it. So it's like right now we're at this like crux where we don't necessarily know what it means anymore because it means so much. But even back then, even very quickly after it became a thing, we didn't know what it meant anymore. Because in doing the That's My Jamstack podcast, I would almost always it was a 5-question, interview style podcast. And one was always, what's your jam in the Jamstack? Like what technology or what philosophy are you really enjoying right now? And why do you like it? And we go deeper in. And at the time, Gatsby was a really big thing. It was one of the first huge frameworks that got real popular real fast. And the way people would talk about it if they came in as a Gatsby fan, if Gatsby was one of their jams in the Jamstack, they would talk about how great it was to have all this dynamicness in the front end. They would talk about how easy Gatsby made it to do the static stuff and the rehydrating. Rehydrating was a huge thing. They thought was the most amazing thing ever. And then you had the other side coming in. And that was like more my side, where I was already an 11D advocate way back then, very early on. It was like months after the, what's it called? The Advent calendar of code. I can't even remember what that, there's a website that does like 24 cool articles. And somebody wrote one about turning Jekyll up to 11D. And it was one of the first times I'd ever heard of 11D. And within months, I was hooked, and I was like talking about it everywhere. But those of us who came from that perspective were all about, I love how it lets me write HTML closely. I love how it ships HTML. I love the performance. I love that it ships no JavaScript. So like we already had this like shipping tons of JavaScript, shipping no JavaScript. And then I mentioned like the conversations with Phil, where like at the time serverless wasn't. So like it's always been a sliding scale. It's always been the percentage of what you're using for the Jamstack. And what I would almost posit in this, and again, this kind of goes back to some of the philosophy, is you have to have some amount of definition so that we can all talk educatedly about it, right? If we don't define some constraint to it, the conversations are meaningless because we're all talking with different definitions internally. So the first step is defining some constraints. We're never going to agree on all of them, but what are the 5 tenets of the Jamstack? Because I think if we say it's static only, then we cut out a lot about what makes and what has made the Jamstack a really vibrant community over the past 6-7 years, however long it's been now. But if we go so far as to saying, say, the Next.js app router, which in fairness, I enjoy using. I think it's a cool piece of technology. If we go so far as to say that's Jamstack, then we've made it meaningless in another way. So what are the 3 to 5 tenets of the Jamstack, and where do we draw the lines so that we can have the educated conversation without excluding the things that make it interesting?
It's a great question. Yeah. And I think you touched on a really good point there where I think a lot of the conversations and the community should be talking about the benefits of why this approach is so good. But instead, we end up having a lot of content about what is it and trying to like define it and figure out where the lines are. And it's a shame because there are so many good bits along the spectrum that kind of get lost in those conversations.
Yeah, and we also just like to like use the newest, coolest framework, and then we also lose that conversation at that point. And again, it's a spectrum for what the Jamstack is. It's a spectrum for those of us who are content creators, right? Like, what do we talk about? What provides the most value? And it's actually somewhere in between. It's almost always somewhere in between. Just like the meaning of Jamstack isn't pure static, isn't pure like edge cached, super cool, frameworks. It's somewhere in between. And so, yeah, it's a sliding scale.
Yeah. I'm interested in going back to movable type time because I at that time, what was I was probably doing WordPress and maybe some static HTML, just learning HTML. I came up on nested tables. I know the horror of trying to do that.
Spacer GIFs and all that.
Yep. Rounded corners is a JavaScript library that adds little images. Yeah. People
I did that manually in CSS too. I didn't always use JavaScript, but I did a little bit of both.
Wow. Yeah. Web developers don't know how good they have it these days.
Exactly.
So I never used movable type, but I am familiar with it. My understanding is it was very popular, maybe around 2000, 2005.
Yeah.
And WordPress came onto the scene at that time.
Yeah.
And it was the same sort of tension that we're seeing here. Movable type in the static world, WordPress in the dynamic world. And WordPress ended up blowing movable type out of the water because of this huge plugin ecosystem, and someone non-technical can suddenly have all this power and do a lot of things. And movable type was just kind of forgotten about in the history of the web. Is that how you saw it play out, and why do you think movable type lost that battle?
So yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I've got great stories around it. First, it's important to say like the web, as in all things that have history, right? History comes in waves and it's cyclical. We always come back to various things over and over again. It's the curse of humanity. But in looking at the way movable type came up and went away, first to do like personal history and personal story time, right? 2007, I went from one newspaper to another. I got my first full-time job as a web developer. And one of my first tasks was redesigning one of our blogs in movable type. And it was a very, very popular blog at the newspaper in Memphis. It had thousands of articles. It had been going for a while already. And in working on it, and I was fresh, right? I was super green. This was all incredibly hard to me. I started, and anytime I need to make a change, I guess I wasn't redesigning at the time, I was just making some updates to the design. Because it had thousands of pages, and because certain elements were across all the pages, if you wanted to make a change to the sidebar widget that had like the featured posts or whatever it was, you wanted to make that change, you had to rebuild. And there's, again, this is 17 years ago. There was no like local environment, right? So you're not testing any of these things locally. You had to rebuild, and it had to rebuild manually all those HTML pages via this Perl script that would run. And I would make literally a typo change, and 30 minutes later is when it would be live. Like, we complain like nowadays about like, oh, these, Hugo's super fast, but 11's taking like, 45 seconds to do my full build. No, not a complaint. Get out of here, kids, right? Back in my day, we waited 30 minutes to realize we broke the homepage and then we had to go fix it again and just like sweat for 30 minutes waiting for the fix. So when WordPress came around, and WordPress was already on the scene at this time, and when our VP of what do we call it? New media is what we called our department back in the day because it was super cool, wanted to adopt WordPress. Heck yeah. Like, let's do it. Like super, like you kind of dove in and you realized just how much easier the developer experience was. Like it was amazing how much better it felt because it was server rendered, which meant that the changes we uploaded via FTP went live immediately. And so when I broke sites, I broke them immediately and fixed them immediately. It was so much better, right? Breaking things so much faster. But the downside comes, right? And so it's very easy in the WordPress ecosystem to do things that are very bad for your user. Or I'm not in the WordPress ecosystem anymore. I've been working in headless CMSs and various cool software as a service things for a while now. But back in the day, we were just starting to talk about caching in a meaningful way in the WordPress ecosystem. Obviously, people who were like super software engineers knew all about caching. I had no earthly idea. And WordPress was just getting its feet under it with the caching. So we were going to move all of our sites to WordPress, all of our blog sites, because waiting 30 minutes for a change was rough. And we wanted better editor experience and all these things that we kind of take for granted now. And we did our first experiment, which was a trial blog. I don't know if you know this, but Americans love to pay attention to big trials that are happening. And we had one in Memphis at the time. And I don't remember what it was, but like it was huge. And it was in like 07, 08. And so we put it on WordPress. It was one of our first experiments with it. And I had no clue what I was doing. I'd used WordPress a tiny bit. I made a site. It worked. It worked on my computer. It worked on everyone's computers. And then the trial happened, right? So like we had a month or so with just a few blog posts coming up, leading up to the trial, a little bit of traffic, no big deal. The trial happens. Day 2. The site is destroyed. Like we're talking, it went from 100 page views a day to like 10,000 in like 10 minutes. Yeah. And like just not up to handling it. Whatever, we were probably on like Media Temple or some like real low end, real cost effective host. Because again, with WordPress, you just choose whatever host makes the most sense at the time. And I had no clue what I was doing. And just that server was destroyed. No clue why. And our VP insisted that we move things back to movable type. And we figured it out. We figured out, no, we need caching, right? Caching is actually the hero of that story. But it was very easy to make something that worked until it didn't. And static works and keeps working until you are somehow able to push something like super breaking to it. And even then, because you're pre-building and you're pre-generating these things, you probably just get a build error. Way better than pushing something that's not going to work. We have our own issues around like we have to trust our host CDNs to make sure they're fast. And we've got time to first byte issues with some of the freemium stuff that we've got. But like static doesn't ever have that issue. Static doesn't come down for Black Friday. It doesn't come down on day 2 of the biggest trial your city has seen in decades. It keeps running. Yeah.
And you could
it doesn't answer the question, but it gives some flavor.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting. And you could probably have, if you had the trial website as a static website, it could probably still be live since then, not touched, and it'll be good. Whereas a WordPress site, WordPress 1.0, or whatever it was back then, if you left that, probably it would get annihilated. Just
that host would have said, no, we don't support that PHP version anymore. Yeah. Like sometime, like again, because we're running code on their servers. Absolutely. Like there's so many security vulnerabilities. They don't want those on their servers. Like I respect that. Later on, I managed my own like PHP and Linux and all that. I wouldn't recommend it. I hate it. But like, I wouldn't have, we refused to put WordPress on our servers. Like we had our own CMS. Don't put WordPress on it. If we're going to host WordPress, and this was at the agency that I worked at, we went with like a WP engine back in the day too. They knew what they were doing. Yeah. And if you know what you're doing, all these technologies work great, but they're all also very easily accessible to people who don't know what they're doing. Yes. Like people just getting into the industry today are going to do the same things that I did in WordPress world in '07. And the nice thing is the modern frameworks do some protection nowadays, but not all of it. And there's still plenty of things that you can make a truly awful user experience out of. Talking like more on the performance side, because all these things are server rendered. If the like you can with like ISR and stuff like that in Next World, like you can have these things continuously like rebuild themselves in your client like over and over again and refetch all this data and lose all of your caching that you so arduously worked for and that these frameworks built in so nicely very easily. I say that having made some, since I don't make a whole lot of production stuff anymore, like some truly awful demos that are pretty slow when they start.
Yeah, but I think that the key there is it's a performance concern, which is forgivable and not catastrophic, whereas a security concern that can take down a brand. Yeah.
And here's the thing about where we're at now versus where we were at back then. I have been doing this a long time. I'm not I'm not a computer science person. I'm very much on the I build things. I teach things. I'm an educator more than anything else. I don't know how Next, all these things, I don't know the underlying things around how they're doing the caching, and I have to trust to the framework and to my host that these things are being done in the best way possible. And the thing that worries me, and I love these technologies, like, let's preface here, right? I like these technologies a lot. I like these companies a decent bit. I only like companies so much because they're companies, they're not people. But like, I worry with how tightly coupled our frameworks get to our hosting providers. It is nerve-wracking. They never lock you in, because I think we all know that is a very poor, that you're going to turn off all your developers. And if you're worried about developers, you're not going to lock somebody in completely. However, all the cool stuff in Next is always going to work first for Vercel. It's going to eventually come to a Netlify. It's going to eventually come to an AWS, but it's going to work first for Vercel. And it's always going to be in their best interest to some degree. And the same goes for, Netlify buying Gatsby. And the same goes for like Netlify, hired Zach Leatherman and let him for a year spend time on 11D. And I love the stuff that he produced around 11D at Netlify. I was writing about serverless from before it was live, right? From the release candidates, because I thought it was such a meaningful and cool update to the framework. But the very first iteration of serverless was with Netlify functions. And Zach is very protective of the community, and I've always adored Zach and how he thinks about these things. So he made sure it worked quickly elsewhere too. But like, it had specific functionality that lets you use their edge functions with just like changing one line of code. And you probably couldn't have done that on the other platforms. And so it's a worry. Like, even somebody who's as amazing at protecting his framework as anyone hit that, right? That's something that got hit. And so looking at it and knowing how tightly coupled some of these frameworks are, it worries me. I mean, I love Astro as a framework. I think Astro is the promise of what React promised us in 2015, right? Like this idea of islands architecture and all that. Of course, now it's a VC funded company, right? And we look at partnerships with Vercel now, and they launched some new features and it didn't work in Netlify, and they had to go back and bug fix, and that took a couple of weeks. Is that a good thing for the ecosystem?
It's a good question. Like, do you think portability should be a core part of Jamstack?
When we talk about tenants, portability feels like it should be one of those 3 to 5. Absolutely.
And then I think that's where I come back to the static versus serverless conversation, because static is very easy to make portable. Serverless functions, would that mean that we need like a standard for serverless, so it can just work across platforms.
Yes, and that's exactly like that's like with this Astro thing that I'm mentioning, and I don't remember the technical details because they were all above my head. Again, there's black magic happening there that I don't know. I use these things. I don't make them, but the fact that it isn't standardized meant that it was very easy for a framework to build to break the implementation somewhere else because they went for what made sense for them economically and probably from a user experience point of view. Most people using Next were probably using Vercel, and most people using Astro were probably going in that direction as well. They went with the first thing, and then they had to come back and like backfill. But if there'd been one standard, the issue with serverless functions is that it almost feels like there is until you try to implement a serverless function on a different platform and you realize, oh no, they're different. Even though they look very much the same, if all you do is like read the blog post on how to use it, they all look like you export a handler, right? Like that's all you have to do. And then you just write JavaScript. It's great.
Yeah.
Not so much, actually.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because like the trade-off there is if it's a standard, then it moves very slowly.
Yes.
And these companies can't innovate and build new things, or they have to wait for the standard to catch up to it. I mean, browser technology is kind of the same.
But if we look at browsers for the past 15 years, and we look at the way, well, let's say browsers since the browser wars, right? Let's talk like all the way back. We're talking like IE5, IE6, Netscape Navigator, initial versions of Firefox. They were fighting each other, just like what we experience. Again, cyclical nature of history, and technology is no different. The hosting wars, the static hosting wars, the serverless hosting wars are very similar to the way that was. And for a long time, that continued happening. And the people who suffered were the developers first and then the users. Because then we started building things that only worked in one browser. And then we started building things across browsers, but then we had to do all these horrible workarounds. And then we realized, oh no, the box model for CSS is different in IE6 than it is in Firefox. And oh no, IE7 actually deviated and fixed it, but now IE6 and IE7 are different, and the box models work differently.
You're bringing back nightmares for me.
My first love is CSS, and so like I'm very passionate about these things. And like my first like thing I was known for at work was I knew how to debug IE6 and IE7, and I had no clue. I'd never read a spec, never read how these things were implemented, but I'd broken stuff enough that I knew what not to do. I knew like paddings work differently. I don't know. I didn't even know the term box model back then, but I knew that if I did padding.
Just for the audience, there's no inspect in IE6 or 7 either. You got to just look at it and try and figure out why it's not working.
Exactly. Why is my float? Why is my element on the right breaking and floating down to below my element on the left? Oh, it's because I added padding to it, and the widths actually add the padding as opposed to subtract. Box sizing border box. Thank you so much. But if we look at that, right, there were losers, and the losers were not the companies. The losers were the individual devs, and the losers were the people who were trying to use things and then told you need to use IE7 despite IE9 being a thing, right? Like IT people refused to upgrade. Like I will never say that a user using an old browser like that, especially back in the day, it's not the user's fault usually. Either they don't know how, they're on hardware that's too old, or their IT department won't let them. And so like I never back then I complained a lot, but like once I got that empathy level and realized these things, it's not their fault. And so it's because of that I look at the current state of things and say, moving a little slower is not a bad thing. And if you look at how the browsers got together finally, and they said, we're going to go in this process. We're going to stop fighting each other. We're going to say, all right, the specification is what we're going to lead with. We're going to implement these features, and we're going to do our own versions of them and like test them out and figure them out. The worst thing in the world was the browser prefixing, because that let developers think they could use things. The best thing was the feature flags that came out, like CSS Grid. The implementation of CSS Grid and how all the browsers did it is, to me, the right way, and it did take a little longer. But if you look at it, people complain about Microsoft and complain about the way Internet Explorer used to be, but CSS Grid comes from Microsoft because at the time it was Windows 8, I think. Whatever had the Metro UI, there was all these blocks in different sizes. They wanted to implement it in code, in HTML, like they had in their OS, but they couldn't because it was just a pain to do in floats, right? You could do it, but you wouldn't. And so they wrote a specification for Grid. And the original implementation is behind browser prefixes, and it's completely different from what was implemented. But they did the first test case. They took it to the W3C. They worked on the specification together. And then the first people to actually launch it were Firefox, to launch the actual specification in their browser. And then all the other ones within a year went from no adoption to full adoption. And that's amazing. Those are giant companies with, honestly, let's be perfectly blunt here. Browsers don't make money, right? So like the resources couldn't have been amazing, and they implemented, because the spec was written, they implemented with very few cross-browser bugs in a year. And that was super fast. That was the fastest it had ever happened for anything that major. So when the companies work together on a spec, it can move fast. And when the companies work together on a spec, it can be completely interoperable. And when the companies work together on the spec, they still make money and it's still okay. And right now, we don't understand that from a technical perspective in the software as a service world, but we're gonna, because history is cyclical, and we're gonna hit that point again at some point.
Yeah. I feel like it takes the leader in the space to make that move, because if they've got the market share, they really don't have any incentive.
Who's the leader in the space? I don't know who the leader in the space is. I know who I like to use, but I couldn't tell you that Vercel is the leader in this space. I couldn't tell you that Netlify is. Could I tell you that Amazon is? Maybe, but probably not. Like, I can tell you the most money is probably being earned by AWS, but does that mean they're a leader in the space? Because they're all, honestly, like, Vercel and Netlify both came into being by being better versions for UX than AWS. Like, you could have done a static site. In fact, I did a Jekyll site in an S3 bucket way back in the day. That was an awful experience. And the very first time that I used Netlify, I said, oh, I understand what's going on. This is what I want. But like those three, like Netlify and Vercel, are they leaders?
Yeah, it's interesting because in terms of Jamstack, like, at least I don't often think of AWS as a platform, but they were, at least to my knowledge, the first with Lambda to have serverless, and everyone else kind of took that model and improved on it.
And the first Netlify functions were all AWS functions. Like, behind the scenes, it was with worse pricing, more expensive, fewer, free requests, because you were getting the niceness on top of it, because you got the developer experience, because you got the user experience. But it was AWS under the hood. It was Lambda functions. That probably was still a better time, honestly.
Yeah, interesting. So let's bring this all back. What do you think? What do you think needs to happen in the Jamstack community for it to remain relevant?
Communities form, and now we're going in a completely different philosophical direction from my time in DevRel, from my time in community building and technology spaces. Communities form around a shared element. So we can talk about communities of locale. Your neighborhood is a community. Your city is a community. We can talk about communities of practice, people who are all working together to learn something or to do something specific. So something like a write the docs community of practice. We can talk about communities of product. So, Hygraph has a Slack community, has a community. All these software as a service companies have communities of product. They all also want to be a community of practice too. But the key to any community is everyone being involved and everyone going towards a shared goal where we all help each other and raise each other up. So the community of Jamstack was once, if we're being honest with ourselves, the Netlify product community. It was a community of product around Netlify because, to your point, maybe you could say that in the Jamstack space, Netlify was the leader, right? They made the term, they did the proper DX and UX around these things that we all needed. Like just the fact that they had like you put Netlify on a form in your HTML and you got a form handler. Yes, please. But the community itself was not of Netlify. And they did a really good job early on with that, right? Like you came into this and you never felt early on like they were pushing Netlify. They were pushing this idea of a community of practice, and they did it very, very well early on. So I'd say that the important thing for the future of the Jamstack community is to find the practice that we all believe in roughly, right? Again, sliding scale, and to help lift each other up through education, through conversation, through community. And it needs to have a place, and it needs to have a voice, and it needs to have advocates. And if it doesn't have those things, it goes away, and you go read my article on the Jamstack is meaningless, and you learn it's okay. It is okay if the Jamstack goes away because of what we learned in getting here. You know, they say like, you know, was it the prize is the friends we made along the way. The prize in this case is the education and the philosophies that we've learned along the way. The philosophies of, I mean, they're still there. They're just very different in like the next world, in the current state of where these bigger companies are going. Edge caching is just what they're calling static things nowadays. And I'm not smart enough to say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I know that it makes me sad because I love writing HTML and I love statically generating things. But if we can continue teaching and raising each other up and learning and doing best practices around whatever we call it, I like the Jamstack. It gave us a nice term that, while we didn't always agree on what it was, we knew that we were roughly talking about similar things. But if we all push towards a future where performance is important, security is important, some sort of pre-generated HTML is important, whether we call that caching or actually static site generation or whatever it is, and how to do it in a way that we all understand and maybe even write specifications. Sure, like I think that's hugely important. Then some form of this community survives and thrives. Does it have to be called Jamstack? I don't know. Should it? I'd love it to be.
Great. That was an awesome answer. Let's end it there. Thank you so much for joining today, Bryan. That was a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, anytime. Loved it.